The last thing Callum Anders remembered before blacking out was the dull thunk of metal biting into his flesh. He'd been too focused on taking cover to notice the enemy's blade coming down in a wild arc. By the time the pain registered, his body had already slammed into the mud. The battlefield spun around him, flashes of gunfire, alien war cries, the acrid sting of burning ozone. Then darkness. When he came to, the first thing he noticed was the sterile tang of antiseptic in the air. The second was the sensation of being strapped down. He tried to sit up, but something firm and rubbery pressed against his chest. Remained still. "You were in critical condition," the voice was frantic, clicking in a way that made Callum's groggy brain recognize it as one of the medical officers from the Xynari coalition. His eyes adjusted to the dim, bluish lighting, and he took in the sight of 3 aliens crowded around him, each with elongated, segmented arms and smooth, iridescent skin that shifted hues in agitation. Their bulbous, lidless eyes reflected the overhead lights, and their fronds twitched as they worked with unsettling coordination. Callum glanced down and immediately saw why they were panicking. His left side was a mess. Blood seeped from a deep gash in his abdomen, pooling onto the metallic medical slab beneath him. He could hear the medics chittering in rapid succession, their translucent medical masks misting up as they worked feverishly. One of them, probably the lead, waved a multi-pronged surgical tool over his wound, the tips glowing a faint green. Another frantically unspooled something that looked like biosynthetic thread. "You are hemorrhaging at an unsustainable rate. Plasma levels dropping. Oxygen saturation compromised." One of them, his name tag reading Drelm, turned toward a floating display and let out a high-pitched trill. "He is losing red cells faster than we can compensate. Why did he not enter shock? This is impossible." Callum blinked sluggishly. "I've had worse," he mumbled. The room fell silent. The 3 Xynari froze, their delicate appendages trembling. Their luminous eyes flicked to one another in what Callum could only describe as sheer disbelief. "You," Drelm's voice quivered. "You have had worse." Callum groaned, feeling the pain sharpen now that the initial numbness was wearing off. He glanced at the deep slash in his side, then back at the horrified medics. "Yeah, took a bad hit once in the Rift campaign. Bled out for a while before evac. This." He tilted his head toward his wound. "Just a scratch." A second medic, Vesic, made a strangled wheezing sound. "Just a scratch." Drone's fronds wilted. "You should not be conscious," he gestured wildly at Callum's vitals. "Your readings suggest catastrophic circulatory failure. You should be in an induced coma." Callum winced as another jolt of pain lanced through him. He sighed. "Look, you've got painkillers, right?" The third medic, Sorrel, hesitated before shakily adjusting the interface of the IV unit, administering higher analgesic levels now. The moment the medication flowed into his veins, Callum exhaled in relief. "That's better," he glanced back at Drone. "Now, can you fix this up before I actually start worrying?" Vesic let out a distressed warble. "This is unnatural. Humans should not have this level of pain tolerance." Sorrel was running scans, his skin shifting to a deep, unsettled violet. This is not just tolerance. His body is compensating far beyond normal biological limitations." Drone seemed to snap out of his daze and refocused on the task at hand. "We must cauterize and suture immediately. If this human insists he is not in critical distress, then we must act before this situation worsens." The medics worked with renewed urgency, sealing Callum's wound with advanced biofoam before stitching the layers of tissue back together. They muttered among themselves, casting wary glances at him as they worked. Callum, for his part, simply watched them with the patience of someone who had done this far too many times before. He flexed his fingers experimentally, checking for nerve damage. "You didn't nick anything important, did you?" Drone sputtered. "Nick anything important? You were nearly eviscerated. We are fighting to ensure your organs do not cease function entirely." Callum frowned. "Okay, so mostly intact." Vesic made another wheezing noise. After another agonizingly tense minute, the final layer of sutures was set in place. Sorrel quickly scanned the wound site, confirming stability. Bleeding has stopped. Tissue integrity holding. Drone still looked shaken. His arms trembled as he deactivated his surgical tools. Human. His voice wavered. Are all of your kind. Like this. Callum let out a breath, feeling the last of the adrenaline fade. Not all of us. But yeah, humans can take a beating, he smirked. We don't go down easy. The three Xynari exchanged looks. Drone finally spoke, his tone reverent and horrified all at once. Your species is terrifying. Callum chuckled. Yeah, we get that a lot. The Xynari medbay remained eerily quiet for a long moment after Callum's casual declaration. The three medics were still processing what had just happened, their elongated arms twitching with residual shock. Sorrel finally broke the silence. We must monitor you for signs of delayed collapse. Callum sighed. I told you I'm fine. He tried sitting up again, this time with more success. The wound in his side protested, but he dealt with worse before. He swung his legs over the side of the medical slab, ignoring the frantic, high-pitched clicking noises from Vesic. Drone practically threw himself in front of Callum, his segmented limbs splayed out in a defensive posture. No, you cannot move. Your circulatory system is still recalibrating. Yeah, well, I'd rather not spend the next few hours strapped to a table while you three stare at me like I'm some kind of anomaly. Callum shot them an amused look. I mean, I get it, you've never seen a human tank a gut wound like that before, but I need to get back to my unit. You are not leaving. Vesic's fronds flared aggressively, but Callum could hear the unease in his voice. Your condition is medically unacceptable. Callum scoffed. Medically unacceptable? That's a new one. Sorrel tapped rapidly at a floating control panel, his body flickering with stress-induced color shifts. Your blood pressure is still unstable. We need to run additional diagnostics. We have never treated a human for this level of trauma before. Yeah, well, now you have. Callum exhaled. Look, I get that you're worried, but I promise you I'll be fine. Drone was staring at the vital monitor as if it had personally betrayed him. How is your body stabilizing this fast? His fingers twitched over the console, triple-checking the readings. Red cell regeneration is accelerating at rates outside of projected parameters. Your immune response is also anomalous. This should not be possible. Callum shrugged. Maybe humans are just built different. Built different? Vesic's voice hit a near hysterical pitch. You bled out for nearly 7 minutes, and now you are attempting to vacate a medical facility under your own power. Callum smirked. 7 minutes? Ha. That's nothing. You should see what happens when we get really messed up. The medics exchanged nervous glances. Sorrel murmured something in their native tongue, and Drone's fronds curled inward. Drone turned back to Callum, his voice taking on a strange, reverent tone. Your species. It is not just pain tolerance. Your physiology is designed to endure extreme punishment. Callum tilted his head. Well, yeah, kinda comes with the territory when your ancestors spent millennia fighting off everything from wild animals to other humans. Adapt or die, right? Sorrel shuddered. Adapt or die. Callum gave him a lopsided grin. Pretty much. Vesic turned back to the medical console, as if desperate for some explanation that didn't involve accepting the sheer absurdity of human biology. Your metabolic processes are still operating at an accelerated state. This level of rapid stabilization is biologically reckless. Callum rolled his shoulders experimentally. My body knows what it's doing. Sorrel's eyes darkened with what could only be described as pure existential dread. Does it? Drone, meanwhile, was still eyeing Callum like he was some kind of eldritch horror given flesh. How much trauma can a human sustain before perishing? Callum scratched his chin. Depends. You mean instantly fatal, or the kind where we just keep going until we drop? Vesic visibly recoiled. Sorrel let out a choked noise. There is a second category. Callum smirked. Yeah, it happens all the time. Adrenaline's a hell of a thing. Drone's limbs curled in on themselves. This is deeply unsettling. Callum clapped him on the shoulder gently, since he wasn't entirely sure how fragile Xynari physiology was. Don't worry, Doc. You'll get used to us. Drone stiffened. I do not wish to get used to this. Callum grinned. Too late for that. Vesic muttered something in their native tongue that Callum suspected was a curse. Sorrel exhaled slowly, then shook his head. We are going to keep you under observation for at least another 6 hours. Callum sighed dramatically. Fine. But only because I don't feel like arguing. Vesic still looked deeply disturbed. Humans are unnatural. Callum leaned back against the medbay wall, folding his arms. Yeah, but we're also really, really hard to kill. The Xynari didn't look comforted by that fact at all. 6 hours of observation turned into 8, not because Callum's condition worsened, far from it, but because the Xynari simply couldn't wrap their collective heads around his recovery. By the time the lead medic finally signed off on his discharge, Callum felt less like a patient and more like a science project. This is highly irregular, Drell muttered as he handed over the discharge tablet. His fronds fluttered nervously. Your vitals are stable, but the speed of your recovery is unprecedented. We cannot predict potential long-term complications. Callum scanned the tablet with mild disinterest, pressing his thumb against the confirmation panel. Trust me, I'll be fine. First time being patched up by aliens, but not my first rodeo. Vesic, who had been hovering nearby, let out a low, exasperated warble. You speak as though this is a common occurrence for you. Do humans routinely sustain mortal injuries and simply recover? Depends on the human, Callum replied with a shrug. But yeah, we're good at bouncing back. Sorrel's segmented arms twitched. This is a gross understatement. Your biology borders on the absurd. Callum smirked. Thanks, I think. Dreln, clearly not in the mood for banter, stepped closer. If you experience any sudden complications, internal bleeding, organ failure, sepsis, you are to return immediately. Do you understand? Crystal clear. Callum hopped off the medical slab, testing his weight. The stiffness in his side was already fading, replaced by a faint itch where the sutures held the gash closed. He rolled his shoulders, flexed his fingers, and gave the Xynari an approving nod. Good as new. Drone looked like he wanted to argue but decided against it. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and turned away, his fronds drooping with what could only be described as resignation. Vesic, however, wasn't done. You may feel physically stable now, but your body endured catastrophic trauma. You cannot simply resume normal activities without repercussions. Callum raised an eyebrow. Watch me. Sorrel made a sound somewhere between a groan and a trill. Humans are incorrigible. Yep, Callum shot them a wink and headed for the door. The Xynari medics watched him leave in stunned silence. By the time Callum returned to his unit, word of his miraculous recovery had already spread. The Xynari weren't exactly known for keeping things quiet, especially when it came to something as baffling as human biology. Callum Sergeant Royce's booming voice greeted him the moment he stepped into the barracks. The burly man's grin widened as he approached, clapping Callum on the back with enough force to make most people stagger. Heard you scared the hell out of the Xynari medics. Something about unnatural resilience. Callum chuckled. Yeah, they're not used to patching up humans. I think I gave them a mild existential crisis. Royce laughed, shaking his head. Classic Anders. You're like a cockroach, can't kill you, no matter what they throw at you. Thanks for the vote of confidence. Nearby, Private Langley looked up from her datapad, her brow furrowed. Wait, wasn't that gut wound serious? I thought you'd be out for at least a week. Guess I heal fast. Callum gave her a casual shrug, ignoring the incredulous look on her face. Fast. Langley set down the datapad and stood. You were eviscerated. That's not something you just walk off. Apparently it is if you're human, Callum quipped. Royce chuckled again. Langley, you've been working with us long enough to know how we operate. Humans don't go down easy. Langley shook her head in disbelief. I knew you guys were tough, but this is something else. Callum shot her a grin. Welcome to the team. That night, Callum found himself back in the medbay, not as a patient this time, but as a curiosity. Drone had requested his presence, though requested might have been a generous term. The medic had cornered Callum in the mess hall, and all but dragged him back to the sterile, bluish confines of the medical facility. "I thought I was clear about no complications," Callum said as he sat down on the familiar slab. "You are not here for complications," Drelm replied tersely. "You are here because your existence raises questions that require answers." Sorrel and Vesic were already waiting, their appendages moving with barely contained urgency as they prepared a series of scanners and instruments. Callum sighed. "So I'm a science experiment now." "You are an enigma," Drelm corrected. "And enigmas demand study." Sorrel stepped forward, holding what looked like a handheld diagnostic device. "We need to understand how your body manages to endure and recover from trauma that would incapacitate most known species." "It is necessary for medical research." "Necessary," Callum smirked. "All right, fine. What do you need me to do?" "For now, sit still," Drone said, his tone clipped. Callum leaned back, crossing his arms as the medics set to work. They scanned, poked, and prodded with a meticulousness that bordered on obsessive. Callum bore it with patience, though he couldn't resist the occasional quip. "So what's the verdict?" he asked, after nearly an hour of testing. "Am I officially the toughest thing you've ever seen?" Drone didn't rise to the bait. "Your resilience defies known biological principles. Your body compensates for blood loss, tissue damage, and cellular regeneration at rates that are, frankly, alarming." "Alarming?" Callum raised an eyebrow. "I thought it was impressive." "It is both," Sorrel admitted. "Your species' survival mechanisms are." He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Excessive." "Hey, when you grow up on a planet where everything's trying to kill you, excessive is kind of the baseline." Vesic let out a resigned trill. "Humans are incomprehensible." Drone sighed. "And yet here you are. Alive. Intact. And somehow unbothered by any of this." Callum grinned. "Told you I'd be fine." The Xynari medics exchanged a look, their fronds twitching in unison. It was clear they still didn't fully understand him or his species, but they were beginning to accept that humans operated on an entirely different set of rules. "Fine," Drone said at last, his voice heavy with reluctant resignation. "You are free to go. But if you sustain another catastrophic injury, do not tell us it is just a scratch." Callum chuckled. "No promises, Doc." As he left the medbay, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of pride. Humanity might not have been the strongest or fastest species in the galaxy, but they were survivors. And that, Callum knew, was what truly set them apart. Callum's body wasn't giving him any trouble, but his reputation sure was. Ever since his little incident in the medbay, the Xynari on the base had started treating him differently. It wasn't hostility, if anything, it was worse. It was fear. Walking through the corridors, he could feel the way their lidless eyes followed him, their fronds twitching in subtle unease. Conversations hushed whenever he passed, and some of the newer recruits had started giving him a wide berth. Even the veteran Xynari, the ones who had fought alongside humans for years, seemed to regard him with a new level of wariness. "Guess I'm a legend now," Callum muttered as he stepped into the mess hall. Sergeant Royce was already there, nursing a protein bar with all the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be eating anything else. He raised an eyebrow as Callum sat across from him. "Took you long enough to notice?" Callum frowned, glancing at the nearby tables. A group of Xynari soldiers had been sitting comfortably until he walked in. Now they were pretending to be very interested in their rations, studiously avoiding eye contact. He sighed. "Come on, it wasn't that bad." Royce snorted. "Callum, you walked off a gut wound that should have killed you. From their perspective, you're either some kind of indestructible war machine or an actual eldritch horror in human skin." Callum leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Great. Just what I needed." "Hey, could be worse." Royce took another bite of his protein bar, grimacing at the taste. "At least they're not running for cover when you walk into a room." Yet Callum muttered. Royce grinned. "Give it time." Callum rolled his eyes but didn't argue. He'd seen how alien species reacted to human resilience before. This wasn't new. But this level of unease? That was new. The Xynari weren't just wary of him, they were genuinely disturbed. And that was a problem. Drone was not having a good time. He sat at his workstation, reviewing Callum's medical data for what had to be the 10th time that cycle. No matter how many times he rechecked the readings, the results remained the same. The human should have suffered far greater complications. His body had endured catastrophic blood loss, major internal damage, and prolonged physical stress. And yet, not only had he stabilized, he had healed rapidly. And worst of all, he had barely reacted to any of it. Drelm clenched his fingers, his fronds twitching with deep unease. Still obsessing, Sorrel's voice was dry as he leaned against the workstation, glancing at the screen. Drelm didn't bother denying it. This defies all medical logic. Sorrel let out a slow, resigned sigh. You know what the humans would say? Drelm flicked his eyes toward him. What? Sorrel's mandibles shifted in a poor imitation of a human smirk. Get over it. Drelm let out a frustrated trill. How am I supposed to get over this? We have encountered countless species across the galaxy. None have exhibited this level of biological recklessness. Sorrel exhaled. And yet, here they are. Functioning. Thriving. It is unnatural. Sorrel's fronds rippled in mild amusement. Or perhaps it is simply human. Drone rubbed his face, exasperated. And that is what troubles me the most. The tension reached a boiling point during a routine training exercise. The unit had been running drills in the combat simulation chamber, a controlled environment that allowed for real-world combat scenarios without the actual risk of death. The Xynari and human soldiers trained together often, but today felt different. Callum noticed it immediately. The Xynari were hesitant, their movements more cautious than usual. They kept stealing glances at him, their expressions wary. Even their formations felt off, as if they were subconsciously trying to keep distance between themselves and the terrifying, indestructible human. It was getting on his nerves. The drill was simple team-based combat against simulated hostiles. The scenario? A crashed supply convoy under siege. Standard stuff. Callum took point as usual, moving with practiced ease through the simulated wreckage. But the moment the first wave of enemies hit, he felt it hesitation. The Xynari soldiers were holding back. Oh, for the love of. Callum pivoted, grabbing a stunned Xynari recruit by the shoulder. What the hell are you doing? Engage. The recruit hesitated, his grip tightening around his weapon. I do not wish to see another. Display. Callum blinked. What? The recruit swallowed. We saw what you endured, what you survived. You're kind. You do not fall. His voice wavered. It is difficult to fight alongside something that does not die. Callum stared at him, momentarily at a loss for words. Then it clicked. They weren't afraid of him because they thought he was a threat. They were afraid because he was unnatural to them, because he broke their fundamental understanding of mortality. They weren't seeing Callum Anders, the soldier. They were seeing something inhuman. Callum exhaled sharply. Time to fix this. Listen up. His voice cut through the battlefield noise, drawing the attention of every Xynari in the squad. You're scared. I get it. You think I'm some kind of freak because I took a hit and kept going. There was an awkward silence. Callum's gaze swept across them. You want to know the truth? Humans aren't unkillable. We die just like everyone else. But we don't stop until we have to. More silence. Callum took a step closer. Yeah, I walked off that injury. But you know what you didn't see? The scars from the times I didn't. He tapped his chest. I've been shot, burned, concussed, nearly drowned, and yeah, I've bled out before. But I only made it because my squad had my back. Because I had them. He let that sink in. You're afraid because you think I don't go down, Callum continued, voice steady. But that's not the point. The point is I get back up, and I need you to do the same. The recruit swallowed hard. Then, slowly, he nodded. Something shifted. The air felt lighter. The tension that had been weighing down on the unit eased. Callum nodded back. Good. Now let's finish this drill. This time, when the next wave hit, the Xynari fought with him. Later that night, Callum found himself back in the medbay, not as a patient, but as an observer. Drone stood by his workstation, scanning over the day's reports. He barely looked up as Callum entered. "Are you injured?" "Nope." Callum leaned against the wall. "Just figured I'd check in." Drone glanced at him, mandibles twitching in suspicion. "Why?" Callum smirked. "Because I think you're still trying to figure me out." Drone exhaled. "That is an understatement." Callum crossed his arms. "Well, here's some advice. Stop trying." Drone hesitated. Callum grinned. "You don't need to understand us. You just need to trust us." Drone studied him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Callum chuckled. "Good. Now, can I finally get a decent meal without everyone looking at me like I'm about to regenerate a missing limb?" Drone sighed. "I make no promises." Callum laughed. Callum exhaled, watching the Xynari process everything. The fear was gone now, replaced by something more solid: understanding. Vesic studied him carefully. "We mistook your resilience for something unnatural. But now I see you are not fearless. You simply choose to keep going." Callum smirked. "Now you're getting it." Drone crossed his arms, his fronds settling. "I still do not approve of your methods of survival, but I now accept that you will survive, regardless of my approval." "That's the spirit," Callum said. "So can we call this settled? I promise I won't drop dead anytime soon." Sorrel let out an amused trill. "If any species could promise such a thing, it would be yours." Callum stood, stretching. "Glad we cleared that up." He glanced at Drone. "So, do I get some kind of least cooperative patient award, or?" Drone groaned. "Get out of my medbay." Callum grinned. "Gladly." As he walked out, the tension that had once followed him was finally gone. The Xynari would never fully understand humans, but they no longer feared them. And that was good enough.